A bit louder for the back. Yeah, okay, great. Well, firstly, thank you so much for letting me be part of your lovely community for the evening. I think it's so cool that you're on Hacknight 520. Yep, we're all good. Yeah, I think it's so cool. You're on Hacknight 520 and I really love your mission. So I hope we're going to have a really interesting conversation tonight. Planning to keep it pretty informal, so please, online in the room, please ask questions, interrupt, tell me about what you're working on and what you're doing and what resonates about some of the things we've been thinking about, but equally some of the questions and challenges you have as well. I'd really love to hear them. As Adam said, we've been working on this intersection between AI and human behaviour, and Dylan here at the front is one of my co-authors on this paper, along with Michael Hallsworth, who's another colleague in the US. And tonight we were going to take you through some of the findings from the research, but also some of the open questions and ideas that we have as well, because I think as many of you in the room would know, when you're thinking about AI at the moment, it takes a lot of humility because the world is changing so quickly. Putting anything out in the world about AI means accepting that there are as many questions as there are answers. And so really keen to have that conversation tonight. I'll take a little step back and maybe I can tell you a little bit about myself, but also a little bit about BIT as well, which will give you a sense of why we're so interested in this topic and why we've been working on it. So the Behavioural Insights team is a pretty unusual company, actually. So it started life in the UK, inside number 10 Downing Street in the Prime Minister's office back in 2010. And that was the time when there was a lot of emerging interest in the ideas that were popularized in the book Nudge by Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler, and a lot of interest in how to apply those ideas to public policy and governments around the world. And so what we did is we set up a team inside number 10, and the mission of that team was really twofold. So the first part of the mission was to bring a more rigorous and sophisticated understanding of human behaviour to public policy. So drawing on the decades of academic research about how we actually make choices and judgments and how we actually behave, which differs radically from some of the classical economic models about people's behaviour. And secondly, we were set up to more rigorously evaluate what works. And that was partly because at that point in time in 2010, there was a reasonable amount of uncertainty and actually even some skepticism about these types of behavioural approaches, like particularly applied to government policy. And so running robust randomized control trials, testing these ideas with real people in ways that were really solid and rigorous was a way to demonstrate that actually you can make changes like adding social norms to a tax letter to say 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time. Turns out that brings forward tens of millions of dollars of revenue, and that really works. So we set about testing ideas like that. And that was 2010, and pretty quickly, different governments around the world got really interested in these approaches. And we're like, hey, actually, could we do some of that as well? And so we actually spun out of UK government so that we could work with a wider set of partners. We, at that time, were still owned partly by the UK Cabinet Office. We were then also invested in by Nesta, which is the Innovation Foundation in the UK. And we also had a structure where the employees had a shareholding as well. And over the subsequent years, we grew the team in terms of impact and the type of work we were doing, the ambition of work we were doing, but still really through that core mission of applying a rigorous understanding of human behaviour and really testing what works and doing all of that through a social impact lens. And we're now wholly owned by Nesta, but we have teams all around the world, including here in Canada. And Sasha has led our team here in Canada since 2019, and it's fantastic to have Canadian projects and representation and to be part of the behavioural science field here in Canada. And really over this time as well, the field of behavioural science has evolved a lot in terms of the types of challenges that we're tackling, the complexity of those challenges, and the types of methods we're using. And that's one of the reasons we've been so interested in this intersection between artificial intelligence and human behaviour. And I guess my story in all of this, so I've been told this week that my accent has become so confused that I need to tell people where I'm from. But so I'm Australian. I grew up in Australia. I'm a lawyer by training and an economist by practice. So I started my career in corporate law and then spent a decade working for the Australian Treasury in government, doing a whole host of different things from tax policy to climate policy to budgets. And then I went to the US and did my postgrad and worked for a while in the US. And then I've been in London with the Behavioural Insights team since the start of 2015 and have led our work primarily on economic policy, broadly conceived. So labour market interventions, economic growth and productivity, gender, consumer regulation. And more recently have been working across the global team on some of these frontiers of behavioural science, including AI and behavioural science. And you know, across our work, and actually I think this might resonate with a lot of you in the room, we've been experimenting with machine learning and AI for over a decade now in our behavioural research projects. So as far back as 2016, we were working with UK Cabinet Office to build predictive models to better target regulatory inspections of things like GP clinics and care homes. Using things like unstructured data from consumer websites that were giving reviews of GP clinics and then seeing if we could use those to better target regulatory inspections to see which clinics were underperforming or performing well. So we've been using those techniques for a long time, but probably a couple of years ago, we started getting, as everybody did, very interested in using generative AI in our research and in our work. And that was everything from using Gen AI in the way we approach qualitative research through to how we designed behavioural interventions. So moving from static text messages or letters or emails to people through to things like WhatsApp chatbots that were much more interactive, dynamic, and personalised. And also in the way that we were analysing data as well. But what we've been trying to do with this piece that we published in September was really to kind of turn that question around and look not at how AI could improve social science research and behavioural research specifically, but to think about what does behavioural science have to say about AI and about the development of AI models, but also what happens when those models hit real people. And you know, what we know is that the current generation of LLMs, they're designed to be used by us. They're designed to be used by people. And yet that interaction between AI and real people is underexplored at the moment, but it's absolutely crucial. And as we'll talk about through this session, really understanding how AI shapes and influences our choices and our behavior is really important for thinking about, you know, whether the promises of AI are going to be fulfilled in terms of productivity gains or innovation and discovery. But it's also really important in terms of shaping the future of human AI collaboration and thinking about what do we want that to look like and how do we mitigate some of the risks while realizing the opportunities. And so this is the framework that we published in September. I'm going to come over here. So we put together this 4-pillar framework, and you can see it sort of moves from the micro to the macro. And starting with before models hit human beings, what does behavioural science have to say about the development of LLMs themselves. And in Augment, we look at really how LLMs can take inspiration from the structure of human cognition, and particularly the way that all of us have broadly two systems of thinking. System one, which is fast and intuitive, but tends to be more biased and error prone. And system two, which is more deliberative, more effortful, and less error prone. But we tend to spend less time in system two. But we're able to move flexibly between the two on a spectrum. And what we're arguing for in this section is actually, are there ways that we could mimic that movement along that spectrum and what we call metacognitive control? So thinking about how we match a cognitive strategy to the task at hand. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this one now, but if you want to chat about it, really happy to dig into the details. We then move into what happens when these models hit the real world, get deployed, and are used by human beings. And we firstly look at AI adoption, and we think about AI adoption not just as a technical or a structural challenge, but also as a behavioural challenge. And one that is shaped by our habits, our heuristics, our social norms, by frictions that you think wouldn't be consequential, but actually are. And thinking about what are those behavioural barriers that get in the way of people using AI, and particularly using it in really value-adding ways. But also, what does behavioural science have to say about how we can overcome some of those barriers to drive faster adoption, but also deeper and more thoughtful adoption? Again, I was actually planning to focus on the last two, but if people want to dive into the adoption questions in the chat, happy to. The next section is about alignment. And we know that our interactions with LLMs and AI are influencing our choices, are influencing our behavior. And this section is really thinking about actually how can we align AI with our psychology and with our values, and what are thoughtful ways to do that, and how can we better understand that interaction and alignment between humans and AI. And finally, zooming out again to this kind of macro picture, we looked at, actually, we've got all of this individual behavior change across people's lives, people's work. It's changing the way that we interact with each other. It's changing the nature of our work, the nature of our discourse. And what does all of that mean at a societal level? And particularly, what does it mean for how our social norms are evolving in terms of how we interact with machines and AI? But also, actually, how does it impact how we interact with each other? What it means to have human relationships, and what the character of those human relationships look like in an age of AI? And also, to what extent can we shape some of this future? Well, what if it is still up for grabs and is dependent on the choices that all of us and our governments and the companies in this space, the choices that we make now, and how do we better shape those? So that's the broad framework. And as I said, tonight I thought, based on what you're all interested in, I would focus on align and adapt. But as I said, ask me any questions and we can dive in anywhere. So any questions now before I get started? Or we'll, get into it. Okay, great. Well, let's start with align. So LLMs are really the first time that we've been able to interact with AI in natural language rather than code. And what that's meant is that we've had this explosion in AI use. We're interacting with LLMs, we're confiding in them, we're arguing with them, we're delegating to them. And what we're seeing is really this giant real-world experiment unfolding before our eyes about this interaction between humans and AI. And, some of that's really surprising. So, actually, maybe it's not super surprising, but one of the emerging dominant use cases for ChatGPT was sexual role playing, and then just a shy second was task delegation and writing. So, these two things that are top of mind for people. But this is all organic. It's not shaped deliberately. It's about how people are spontaneously interacting with LLMs. And what we're seeing across the board is that LLMs are really powerful influencers of human behavior. And here's just two quick examples of that. So on the left, you have a piece of descriptive analysis, which is looking at the frequency of words in YouTube transcripts. And you can see that the launch of ChatGPT coincides with this, enormous uptick in the use of the word delve on YouTube, which is a pretty good proxy for actually how we're using language across the board. And, it's really significant. And you've seen a similar increase in things like M dashes. And really it's changing even how we're using language, how we're communicating with one another. But even deeper than that, on the right, you can see the results of an experiment that was run earlier this year. And the setup of this experiment was that the participants were asked to complete a quiz, and they were randomized to either get assistance from a human in answering the quiz questions, and the quiz was about identifying different types of images, or they were randomized to get LLM assistance. And the quality of that assistance varied across both the humans and the LLMs. And what you can see from the chart here is that LLMs are really powerful persuaders, more powerful than humans. And that's in both directions. So they were more able to convince the participants to choose the correct answers on that quiz, but they were also significantly more able to convince those participants of the incorrect answers. And I mean, this is an illustrative experiment, but I think it speaks to some deeper questions and issues around ethics, around moral behavior, around our propensity to lie and cheat, and what that looks like with and without AI assistance. And these are really consequential for lots of different parts of our lives, from the way that we work through to the way that we interact with one another, the structure of our economies, the level of deception across the economy. So I think there's some really interesting things to dig into there. And, across the board, there's been a lot written and a lot talked about in terms of bias and LLMs, and particularly bias and AI. And, it's definitely the case from the literature that, firstly, LLMs seem to have quite similar behavioural biases to what we have as humans. And that's unsurprising because they're trained on our data and our knowledge and understanding. So we've imbued them with some of our foibles in terms of the way that we think and some of the errors we make in our thinking. But in this paper, we were also interested in the question of, actually, could LLMs also make us better decision makers? And might they have the potential to de-bias our decisions as well as to reinforce and amplify some of the biases that we already bring to our decision making? And so to really dig into that question, we designed a randomized control trial, which we ran online. We have an experimentation platform called Predictive where we can do this type of work. And what we did is we put together a sample of 4,000 adults across the US and the UK, and they were representative of the general population. And we gave them 4 common behavioural bias scenarios. So you can see those on the right. So there are things like the sunk cost fallacy, which might be one you're all familiar with, which is that we tend to stick with bad decisions when we've invested time and money and resource into them, even if the better course of action would be to cut our losses and to move on. And that afflicts us in everything from organizational decision making through to, do we go to the movies on a Friday night because we bought the ticket, even though we really, really don't want to go? So personal and professional. And we also did this with a moral reasoning problem, which was the trolley problem, which I can talk about in a sec. And across these 5 scenarios, what we did is we randomized people to have different levels of AI assistance. So they either had no AI assistance, they were given the option of using an AI, but they didn't have to. They were forced to use an AI to answer the scenario. Or we gave them what we called a reflective LLM. And at BIT, we use Gemini. So we built a Gemini gem. And what we were trying to do here was pick up some of the thinking I talked about in Augment, which was this idea of metacognition. And metacognition is basically thinking about thinking. It's about thinking about our cognitive strategy, reasoning through a problem. And what we were trying to achieve with this reflective LLM was to prompt people with questions that would allow them to reason through the scenario and to think through the scenario in a way that we hypothesized would mean that they were less biased because they were effectively engaging their deeper system 2 thinking in a more deliberative way. And this is what it looked like for the participant. Actually, before what do you think happened in this experiment? Anybody? Do you think LLMs can debias our decisions? Which of these do you think was kind of most or least effective? Do you think any of them backfired? Yeah, please. Sorry, can you say that again?
How biased the examples you use for different scenarios versus how much we throw in little things that vary that much.
Yeah, they were by the book. Yeah. So they were very classically defined behavioral bias scenarios. So you think?
I think they're but
okay.
I think the reflective LLM would probably do the best in that case.
Yep. Oh, sorry, I'm doing this wrong by not getting the microphone.
Seems most people for now.
So for the people online, the question was, did we describe these scenarios sort of by the book in terms of what a classic behavioral bias scenario would look like? And the answer is yes. And then the prediction was, yes, they would debias us and that the reflective LLM would do the best. Does anybody else want to weigh in? Yeah, up the back.
Hello. I think it depends really heavily on what you prompt the LLM with ahead of time.
Yep. And the prompting was done by the participants. So the interactions were with the participants. So we built the structure of the LLMs, but then the prompting and the question asking was by the participants within the scenarios.
So in that case, did you see examples of the LLM basically trying to cater to the presentation that the participants put forth, or?
Do you want to answer that, Dylan?
Oh, sorry.
So when the participants are prompting the LLM, right, was the LLM reinforcing their prior beliefs, or was it doing it from an objective, averaged out type of scenario?
Yeah, the latter.
Yeah, objective and averaged out was the answer. Yeah, I think there's 2 here, and then I'll do the big reveal.
I imagine these scenarios were well covered in the training material. And consequently, is there any reason why they wouldn't do well? I mean, your subjects are interacting with a corpus of knowledge that is pretty extensive and that has a lot of examples in it and a lot of explanation in it.
Yeah.
So I see no reason why it wouldn't work.
Okay, great. I'll do the big reveal in a sec. Yeah. Raphael.
But the only difference between the different versions is how people access it?
Between the nudge LLM and the shown LLM, the only difference is how they access it. Okay. The reflective LLM had a different structure in that it asked people questions back rather than giving them a suggested answer. So I've got one more question and then I'm going to show you the results.
Did you just train the LLM or you add guardrails?
What's that?
Was there any guardrails?
So they were pretty rudimentary LLMs. So we built them as Gemini gems. So they were based on Gemini, but They were
So basically you rely on whatever Gemini provided as guardrails.
exactly.
You didn't add anything.
We added to the reflective LLM to encourage it to ask those prompting questions, but we didn't change the structure of Gemini for the other two.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for all your ideas and suggestions. Let me show you what we found. So in 3 out of the 4 scenarios, we found that the LLMs did debias people's decisions, but actually there's a fair bit of variation. And I guess to your very interesting point, what we see is that like it doesn't completely debias people. It reduces the level of bias, but it doesn't get rid of it altogether. And actually the design of that interaction is really consequential. So where people are forced to use the LLM, that has the biggest impact on how biased their decision is. Like you, we hypothesized that the reflective LLM would be the most effective, and it wasn't. And there's a couple of potential reasons for that. So we actually saw really high attrition in the reflective LLM arm, and our thinking afterwards was that the way that it worked, and like I said, these were pretty simple Gemini gems that we built. The way that it worked is that it just kept asking questions of people. And we thought actually, like if we built this again, and if we took that core idea again, we would have something that was more flexible and more sophisticated to try and reduce that attrition. And that might increase the impact of the reflective LLM as well. But I guess kind of zooming out from the result, what we took from this is that actually there is promise in using LLMs to try and debias people's decisions and make people better decision makers, to counter some of the, I guess some of the discourse and the literature about how they can potentially reinforce bias. I'll come to you in one sec. And also that there is, I think, still promise in this idea of a reflective metacognitive interaction with LLMs as well. And there's at least 2 hands at the back. So let's, yeah. Oh, hang on. Maybe wait for the microphone so the people online can hear you.
So
that's okay.
In this experiment, you didn't have another option, I suppose, where a person got to talk through the problem with another person.
We didn't, no. It was all kind of comparing no AI assistants to AI assistants. So you're right. It would be super interesting to.
Okay, so there's no information on whether these results are because someone had to talk through it with something that could talk back to them versus specifically like an LLM.
No, but I mean, that would be a fantastic experiment.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I may have misunderstood you there, but I heard you just make kind of a leap where, yeah, I said I thought there was no reason it wouldn't work within some pretty narrow strictures. It doesn't mean I think it would generalize, and you were kind of implying that this meant that it would generalize well to actual problems in real life, as opposed to these.
You're right. That is a leap, and you're right to pull me up on it. There's a lot of things that need to happen before we would say this would generalize, but I think it's a promising avenue of research. Yeah, but you're right to call me up on that. Great. Okay, well, let's quickly go through ADAPT, and then we can open up for broader questions. So this is the section where we were, as I said, zooming out to think about what are the implications for the evolving social norms of society, particularly how we interact with machines and then how we interact with each other. And some of our guiding questions and provocations for this came from the leaders of AI firms. So particularly Mustafa Suleyman and Sundar Pichai, that we must build AI for people, not to be a digital person. And that the future of AI is not about replacing humans, it's about augmenting human capabilities. And in this section, we were really trying to think through what does that look like from a behavioral perspective and from a cognitive perspective. And in this question of how we interact with AI and what that collaboration looks like, Some of the research we dug into was on cognitive offloading and cognitive degrading. And at a high level, those two things, so cognitive offloading is about what are the tasks that we're delegating to AI that free up our mental bandwidth and literally are sort of taken off our mental load and put onto an AI. And that's not, that can be a really positive thing. But it can also, the risk and the concern is that over time, if that's done repeatedly and at scale, it can lead to a degradation of cognitive skills and abilities. And at the moment, the evidence for the former is emerging, but fairly strong in terms of, yes, we do seem to be offloading certain types of tasks to AI, particularly around search and synthesis. And this chart shows some of what that looks like. This is descriptive data from Microsoft Copilot. The evidence on the latter is emerging and very early stage about actually what does that do to our cognition over time. And it also sits against the backdrop of a broader decline in cognitive abilities over the past decade and more. So if you look at the OECD PISA scores, which are basically standardized scores of literacy and numeracy in school-age children across the OECD, you see that basically from sort of just after 2010, you see a pretty steady and marked decline in both literacy and numeracy skills across the OECD. And so these risks are sort of sitting against that broader backdrop. And there's been a lot written about that broader backdrop. There's no causal evidence of actually what's driving that, but there's arguments and some correlational evidence about the rise of social media and the attention economy and the modern information environment against that. But as I said, that's correlational. And so really the big question here is whether AI will accelerate some of that degradation or whether it may actually have the potential to attenuate it in some ways as well. And I think the more kind of hopeful, optimistic take of could it be something that attenuates some of that, that cognitive decline and degrading is this theory of the extended mind. And this is a theory that was first put forward in the late 1990s by two philosophers. And their idea and their theory was that actually throughout history, we've always externalized some of our cognition and our thinking. So from writing back in ancient Greece, and, if you go back to Plato was writing about how Socrates was worried that writing would implant forgetfulness in men because they would not be able to recall from their memories anymore because of written instruments. And he was very worried about this impact of writing on our cognition and on our humanity. It turns out I think that was largely misplaced, as the arc of history has shown. But more modern ideas around this are around things like calculators or GPS. And Clark and Chalmers argued that those types of tools have externalized some of our cognition, but they have ultimately extended and changed the way we exercise those skills. So if we're using GPS, it doesn't change our spatial reasoning skills. Sorry, it doesn't get rid of our spatial reasoning skills, but it changes the way that we deploy them and effectively extends our ability to deploy them. And I think it's a really interesting question of, is Gen AI a similar extension of the mind? Is it something that allows us to be more creative, to augment our capabilities, to achieve more, to be more productive or more thoughtful or more anything, or not? And there's some interesting, and again, this is really early stage research. The reason there's a go board here is that some of the early research is about creativity. And some of the studies of Go players show that where they're shown moves that an AI would make on a Go board, it opens up these possibilities that they never thought of themselves and feel like they maybe never would have thought of themselves, which then enhances their play as a human. And so are there areas like that? And also, what does that collaboration with AI have to look like to unlock this type of extension of the mind, in terms of what's done independently, what's done in partnership, what's the structure of that? I realize I'm speaking too much, so I'm going to zoom through the next slide or two, and then we can wrap up. On the sort of how it's shaping human interactions and relationships, I think one of the really interesting kind of early test cases for this is AI companions. So these are hugely popular. They're being used by millions of people around the world. And as you can see here, this is a rather provocative but real marketing ad from Replica about how terrible real life partners are. They don't care about you. They've got weak emotional support, and look at them in their like gray hoodie. It's terrible. Yeah. But there's a really deep, serious question under this, which is, are these kinds of AI interactions going to become substitutions for human relationships? Or might they distort what we expect of human relationships? In this case, if you're spending a lot of time interacting with the AI on the right, does it mean that actually you're less willing to compromise or deal with complexity and nuance in real life relationships, whether they're intimate or friendships or colleagues or family? And again, I think there's like some real choices here about how these are designed, how they're accessed. I think there is a world where actually an AI companion could be a fantastic coaching ground for a real life relationship, particularly for younger people, to say like, what does it look like to be a good partner who asks great questions, who is supportive in different ways, and challenging in different ways. And I guess there's also this kind of slightly darker potential future as well. And then finally, just to end, as I said, I think a lot of these potential futures are still up for grabs, and it is for us to think about what sort of future lives and collaborations we want with AI. And we talk in the paper about some specific mechanisms to enable people to feed into those discussions and deliberations, particularly participatory and deliberative methods that bring in a collective representation of users and citizens to help shape some of these decisions. We've worked with Meta on those types of community forums to shape platform governance decisions. Those are happening at an industry level at the moment. I would love to see them be happening at a national and cross-national level, or even at a city level as well, actually. But I do think these are really deep questions about not just how we use AI, but also, how the character and nature of our societies, of our economies, and really how we go on. So I'm going to leave you with that, but I hope that sparked some interesting thoughts. The whole paper is here at this link, and then we just did an interview with Google DeepMind last week that got published and has a bit more detail, and then that's my LinkedIn if you want to connect as well. But yeah, I'll leave it there, and thanks so much for your attention and engagement and questions. It's been really great.